Greetings everyone, Crimson Oracle here. Today I'm starting a new series that's a bit off my beat. For the past 3 years I have exclusively played board games, skirmish games, and role-playing games, but before that I was really into Warhammer 40k. I played 6th and 7th editions extensively, and while they have a bit of a bad rap now, truly that period was where the game peaked for me. So I wanted to do a series of retrospectives on 7th edition Warhammer 40k as a sort of love letter to this flawed masterpiece, which in part lives on to this day as the core mechanics of the Horus Heresy game. Rather than start with the game itself though, which I agree was a bit of a mixed bag, I wanted to start with the things that I'm most passionate about. So we will start with what is for me the greatest codex of all time, and that is...
Master, we talked about this.
No, I want to tell them now.
You agreed you would stick to the agreed upon script. You have to engage in showmanship. You have to make your content compelling. This is fundamental to achieving YouTube dominance.
Fine. I will use showmanship. Showwomanship? Regardless. I will tell you what my favorite codex is, but we have to take a little journey first. And it starts with you clicking that like and subscribe button and sharing this video with your friends if you think it's interesting, because that is how this channel grows. I also wanted to take a moment and caveat that this is a subjective topic. I haven't played every army list in every edition of Warhammer 40,000. I can't say with 100% certainty that there's no other army that I would love as much as my personal favorite, but I do doubt it for reasons that we'll get into later. As someone who didn't play 40k in 3rd edition, that was the era of the legendary 3.5 Chaos Codex that's often cited as a contender for greatest of all time, I'm only really able to evaluate the codex as I play extensively. And for me, one codex stands out so far from the crowd, and in fact, it was the loss of it that wound up souring me on the entire game and leading me to quit Warhammer 40,000. That's how much fun this book was. But before we get to it, we have to take a step backward. In many ways, this story starts way back in the 1990s. Sobe energy drinks were all the rage, Everclear and Len were topping the charts, and I was a middle school nerd who had just discovered my stepfather's old hardcover Realms of Chaos books. Oh, glory. Warhammer 40,000 was introduced with a book called Rogue Trader. It was the first depiction of the grim dark future of the 41st millennium. The initial book came with rules for Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Eldar, and Orcs, but this was before the formal introduction of the Chaos Gods, which we all know and love. That would come in 1988 and 1990 in the form of 2 enormous hardcover books, Realms of Chaos Slaves to Darkness and Realms of Chaos Lost and the Damned. Reading through these books was amazing. I'd played Battle Masters as a kid, and the Chaos Warriors were from the same design. I had played Talisman extensively, and I always chose the Chaos Warrior because of his beautiful Baroque armor. I'd browsed Warhammer catalogs as a kid, but I never knew the story of the Horus Heresy or the Chaos Wastes of the Old World. The models were similarly amazing. Bold colors, strange conversions and customizations. This was everything I wanted out of a hobby. But I was a middle schooler without the resources to start buying Warhammer models. So I got a couple of friends to build Chaos Warbands using the random chart at the back of the book, and we fought battles using the quick reference Warhammer Fantasy battle rules that we found in the inside cover of the book, because we didn't have a 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy rulebook. We played with paper scraps on tabletops with Coke cans as our terrain. We made the game happen, even though we had none of the resources necessary to play. We played a campaign, and I was in love. I was so excited for it that my parents got me Mordheim for my birthday when it came out in 1999. Unfortunately, I would gradually lose interest as high school sought to crush the individuality out of me. Spoiler alert, they only succeeded temporarily. Nonetheless, I would not pick up models or paints again until the fall of 2007. When my friend discovered his old Space Marines in his parents' attic. Remembering my love of Games Workshop games, playing through the Dawn of War expansions, I immediately jumped at the chance to dive into the game. I bought a starter set, a battle force of Chaos Space Marines, and the newly released Chaos Space Marine Codex. the book that replaced the legendary 3.5 book that everyone remembers so fondly. I set about building and painting, but I started to notice a huge gulf between my recollection of Warhammer 40,000 from Realms of Chaos and the reality of what was in my Codex. Units didn't have many options for customization, much of the randomness of playing Chaos was gone, and what's worse, they'd absolutely botched the iconic Chaos demons that defined the faction to me. Once fully fleshed out units, and the shift from the narrative excess of 3.5 edition to the austerity of 4th edition, demons had been reduced to 2 entries in the Codex, Greater and Lesser Demons. Greater Demons had to possess one of your existing generals to come onto the field, and they had minimal rules to make them interesting. And Lesser Demons, they were just cannon fodder, and neither had anything to differentiate between demons of the different gods. Bland doesn't even begin to describe it. They were narratively incoherent, the rules weren't even good on the tabletop, but beyond that, they'd taken an entire spectrum of weird ethereal beings and reduced them to being guardsmen with no guns and an invulnerable save. Demons are supposed to be manifestations of aspects of their god, the 4 gods representing wildly different kinds of human emotions and flaws. Boiling these lesser demons down to a single unit that was only good to camp objectives was one of my first experiences with a concept that we will talk about extensively, called ludonarrative dissonance. This is when the mechanics of a game and the story of a game, or in this case tabletop, but the term comes from video games, actively clash with the story the game is telling. It's a frustrating thing to experience because viscerally you know something is wrong when you play, but we'll get into that more later. I was therefore incredibly happy when Chaos Demons not only got full rule support, but new characters and totally unique playstyle, albeit one that was a little outside the box. Crucially though, something was missing. There wasn't a way to take demons in a Chaos Space Marine list or vice versa. This was a pretty big disappointment for those of us who didn't have a full army of demons, but wanted to use them with our Chaos Space Marines. It also didn't help that the Demons book was definitely written around the idea of taking all 4 Chaos gods in your list. Trying to take a list from one single god would seriously hamstring your ability to even do anything. It wasn't unplayable, but it was not the kind of design that I was looking for. It really didn't fit with what I wanted to do with my army. Personally, I was graduating college at the time. I was dealing with the Great Recession. I was enrolling in and starting grad school. So while I continued to buy and paint Warhammer models, I didn't play much during the 5th edition that came out a few months after the Chaos Demons Codex. While I was interested in playing, I was mostly reading competitive-minded players who all universally crapped on the Chaos Space Marine Codex, which was the only playable army I had. So, for a large part, I sat out the 4 years of 5th edition. I played occasionally, I built models all the time, I painted constantly, but what I didn't do was regularly get out to the game store to play games. That would change in the summer of 2012, with the release of 6th edition and Chaos Space Marines taking the flagship role as the villains in the starter box. A new codex followed, which I enjoyed very much. It didn't go over particularly well with the player base, and it got a bad rap for not being particularly good. Personally, I played it primarily as Death Guard. I found my niche playing Typhus and Mark of Nurgle Terminators, deep striking in to do damage, while hordes of zombies controlled the battlefield. It wasn't perfect, but it felt good to have an army whose playstyle I liked, and for the first time since I had started playing Warhammer 40k, the actual game was fun. A Demons Codex came out a few months later, along with a bunch of new units, and crucially, the new edition had a system for bringing in allies to your games. Suddenly, the old glory of Chaos Space Marines lumbering along next to skittering waves of Nurglings wasn't just the domain of playing Apocalypse games once a year. This codex would of course become notorious in its own right in years to come, as it became one of several ways to create units with a re-rollable 2-up save, something that would cause a lot of hurt feelings around the gaming table. It wasn't perfect, but each faction fit their theme well enough, and you could play a mono-god list. It was into this fertile environment that a new codex would come, and change the way I think about game rules entirely. But first, the game had to get a new edition. An incredibly short 2 years was all that 6th edition got, being replaced in 2014 by 7th edition. This was jarring to say the least, as previously the shortest edition had been 4 years, in 5th. The new game had a lot in common with 6th edition. In fact, it was sometimes thought of as more of a cleanup and refinement, 6.5 if you will. They're often lumped together as sort of the same period of 5 years, where everyone was playing the game a certain way. It is 2 different editions, but they're so iterative and so close that it's not really comparable to a lot of the other edition shifts. In fact, they didn't even get a new starter set. They literally just reprinted the exact same starter set with new rulebooks in it for 7th edition. 6th edition had seen the release of formations, ways to bring units into your army outside of the old force organization tree that the game had used. 2 HQ units, 3 elites, 3 fast attack, 6 troops, and 3 heavy support. It used to be that was your whole limit on your army, but formations would allow units to be brought in and gain special rules for being taken together, and they were intended to be thematic in nature. The release of 7th edition coincided with the introduction of a even further from the combined arms detachment, as they would later be called, way of building your armies, coming with the Necron Codex in the form of the Decurion detachment. There was never an official name for these detachments. I called them metaformations. Most people called them Decurions, whether they were talking about Necrons or not, simply because it's what came first. Similar to how a lot of people refer to Warhammer Underworlds as Shadespire, because that was what the marketing called the first season of the game. I'll address the topic of Decurions more fully someday. Talking about 7th edition, it will have to come up, but this will get us caught up to the state of things when the particular codex I have in mind dropped. It is into this fertile landscape that Khorne Daemonkin released in March of 2015. It was inspired by the random warband that had been featured in the 6th and 7th edition Warhammer 40k starter set Dark Vengeance, a Space Marine chapter that were cursed by Khorne. They were compelled to kill as the only relief from their suffering, driving them to become renegades, and as they became more and more twisted, taking on demons as a tool of warfare. The Crimson Slaughter became an archetype for a certain kind of Khorne warband, not necessarily survivors of the Long War or ancient Chaos Space Marines, but demon worshippers who made great use of possessed and demon engines to do their dirty work. Crucially, this book would combine units from both Chaos Demons and Chaos Space Marines, giving players a unique experience that was not like playing Khorne CSM or Khorne Demons, or even the two allied together. This was its own thing. The background in the book is perfectly tuned to the essence of a Khorne warband. It emphasizes the cult-like devotion to the Blood God, the constant, daily killing that the Blood God demands, and the ultimate devotion of any Khorne demon being their red-handed god, not to any mortal lord. In fact, the timeline of the book is filled with brutal confrontations between Daemonkin and other Chaos factions. Apparently a common side effect of fighting with these psychopaths is them turning on you at the drop of a hat. The book even says they'd rather turn on each other and cut each other to pieces than go a day without devoting a murder to their god Khorne. As is common in cults to the ruinous powers, rather than recoiling from the uncanny nature of those possessed by demons, they worship them, and the warriors committed their bloody wars, acts of devotion to Khorne, to tear through the very fabric of reality, and demons come pouring forth from that rift. The rituals and sacrifices of the warband bring in demons without directly resorting to Khorne's hated sorcery. This was so refreshing.
The book opens with a story about a warrior of Khorne. "Skulls for the Skull Throne," roared Kargas, swinging his chainsword hard into his enemy's face. Blood sprayed and shattered teeth rained from a sundered jaw. Even as his victim fell, Kargas was bullying forward. His boot crushed the fragile alien's chest, shoving it down into the mud. The Chaos Space Marine grinned hungrily as he heard bones crunch and viscera squelch. Through the red fog that clouded his brain, Kargas dimly registered impacts against his breastplate. Snapping his head up, the renegade saw more slender, yellow-armored foes pouring fire into him from mere yards away. Ignoring the wounds gouged in his flesh, he revved his chainsword and threw himself at these new prey, intent only on slaughter. "Blood for the Blood God!" Kargas screamed, bringing his chainsword around in a savage arc that tore the helm from his nearest assailant. The Guardian's body crumpled, blood jetting from the ragged stump of its neck, head rolling to a stop, a dozen paces distant. Already the Chaos Space Marine was onto his next victim, roaring like a beast as he punched the blunt muzzle of his bolt pistol hard into the alien's helm. Crystal eye lenses shattered, finely crafted mesh plating buckled, and blood spurted as the weapon stove in the guardsman's skull. Kargas squeezed his trigger, snarling in satisfaction as his victim's head came apart amid the heavy thud of bolt shells and the wet splatter of brains. The last of the craven aliens turned his tail and fled, but Kargas was on them in moments. His chainsword swung in long, roaring sweeps, and the Eldar came apart in showers of blood and flesh. Pausing for a moment amid the corpses of his victims, Kargas stared around with wild eyes. Everywhere he could see the Skullsworn tearing through the Eldar of Craftworld Eandon. The renegades howled Khorne's praises as they killed. Axes rose and fell, and severed heads thumped into the mud. As the death count spiraled higher, Kargas tasted the harsh tang of copper and sulfur on the air. Glancing down, he saw a thick, blood-red mist swirling around his legs, billowing up from the ground like smoke from a volcano. All along the battlefront, the blood mist manifested, great banks of it blanketing the combatants on both sides. At the same time, Kargas saw the looming shapes of Eldar Wraith constructs launching a counterattack through the murk. They hacked into Govida's frenzied berserkers, eldritch blades sparking against the whirling chain-blade teeth. Kargas gave a harsh bark of laughter and charged headlong into the fight, hacking the legs out from under the nearest Eldar construct. From the depths of the bloody fog, there rose the braying of demonic horns. Kargas drew back his head and howled in exultation as he felt the veil tear open. The Sacred Ones had come, drawn to battle by the Daemonkin's blood offering. Now the Eldar would be butchered like the cowards they were, and Kargas would prove himself worthy of Khorne's favor. After this, it describes Khorne in all of his horror, sitting on his throne of skulls, his great sword by his side. The book then spends a great deal of time and effort describing the various legions of Khorne and the ways that they're organized, something that was really refreshing at the time, as books tended to be a bit less specific about the faction organizations and structures. This has greatly improved in the recent codexes, and they are an excellent narrative resource, and this book's fluff section is as well. I definitely recommend taking a look at it if you can track down a copy of the book. I personally have a digital copy that I am able to continue accessing because that's one of the nice things about keeping these things backed up. The book takes particular care to describe the various markings and color schemes of a whole bunch of different Khorne warbands. And what's really cool about this is they make a lot of effort to show the variety of ways that you can do things like squad markings and different colorations on the various demons and weaponry, and even on the Chaos Space Marines themselves, though all are very much in the recognizably crimson-tinged Khorne milieu. They are a fair amount of variety. As you can see, there is a good bit of creative ideas. I particularly like the synergies between the demons summoned by warbands and their markings. It's a really cool idea that the ones doing these sacrifices would influence the outcome and appearance of the demons that they are summoning. I had never really thought of it that way before, but it works pretty well. So I really enjoyed that addition, and I think it really helps flesh things out. The book, of course, covers a number of the most famous warbands in the world of the Khorne Daemonkin, but this is, not particularly exciting stuff outside of the realm of any narrative of Space Marines doing violence. I enjoy it for what it is, but it's not, anything that is new territory compared to any of the previous codexes. But it does set the stage really well for what comes later, which is the setting up the promise of the story. And that's something that I really want to emphasize about what is great about this book, is it
creates a landscape, an idea, an image of what a khorne Daemonkin warband looks like and how it fights and what it would be like to participate. And it's horrifying in many ways. And, it's not trying to romanticize the violence and awfulness of these creatures. It's more, heavy metal, kind of like, dude, that's so metal than any kind of justification of their actions. But the book really paints a picture, including all of this magnificent art that you're seeing go across the screen, and all of the wonderful descriptions and little anecdotes and quotes. It offers a really vivid image of what you should be expecting when you play the army. And that's what every army's background section, I called it fluff a little bit earlier, and that's a bit pejorative, but the background of the book should give you a desire to dig in and play with the army and present things that you're seeing and tell your own stories. And, it's something that I really liked about the expansion of the recent Necromunda books, where they added a whole bunch of additional material for each of the gangs, and this added a ton of extra stuff to sink your teeth into. As someone who played Chaos, this was a new avenue. It wasn't really about the legions or even, the most popular of the undivided legions. It's really its own thing, and it wasn't anything anyone was really even asking for, which means that it was a passion project of someone in the studio. Someone really thought that they wanted to bring this concept to life, and you can tell that playing it. You can tell it was made with love and not made on a schedule in order to try to get the product out the door on time. And I do agree with certain criticisms of the way GW puts out product now. It feels very workmanlike. It feels like they have a lot of crazy deadlines and they are overworked. And while I understand, it would be nice if the studio would just try to not produce things at such a pace. But, I'm getting off track. I'll finish talking about the background of the book with a quote that I liked from the Chaos Space Marines section of the book. "I salute you, for though our path has been bloody, you have served our Lord with unflinching courage and the honor of true warriors. We have seen many fall today and must remember, even as we die, that our blood too is welcome." Last words of Renegade Harkin Iron Fist. So, now that we know the story khorne Daemonkin wants us to experience, it's time to get meta about game design for a minute. The term ludonarrative dissonance comes from two words, ludic, which means playful, and narrative, which means story. It refers to a clash between the story of a game and the game's actual gameplay and mechanics. It was coined in a 2007 blog post by game designer Clint Hocking, discussing the game BioShock and the contrast between the game's mechanics, which incentivize you killing the little sisters in the game for a resource called Atom to power up, and seeking your own advancement without thinking about the suffering of others, and the game's story, which is linear in nature and sees the player acting based on a sense of greater social good. I think particular criticism in this case is a fascinating topic because I actually think the game could entirely work as intended if you think about it on a different level. While the player can choose to malevolently kill their way through Rapture, harvesting every little sister they find, ultimately their choices aren't their own free will, so I don't think it has to be read as a conflict, but that's a whole essay unto itself. Regardless, the term was initially applied to video games, but it's equally valid when discussing tabletop games. Most anyone who has played a tabletop game over the years can tell you about a time when they played something, they painted it up, they worked hard building it, maybe lovingly converted it, and yet when they put it on the table, the model's rules just didn't match their idea of it. The story of the model and the model's background clashed. The mechanics didn't represent the story the game told you you were going to get. While I had experienced much ludonarrative dissonance over the years playing Chaos. I had found ludonarrative synergy for the first time playing Chaos Space Marines, the start of 6th edition. Swarms of zombies clogging the playing field, Death Guard Terminators and Obliterators and Mutilators teleporting into the fray with lightning-fast brutality. No vehicles, just lines and lines of meat for my opponent to cut through. This was how the Death Guard make war. And an army that could play perfectly to that theme was so refreshing. But while this was very cinematic, mechanically, pushing 100 zombies around the table wasn't actually my favorite way to play. I prefer fast armies, close combat, and while the Death Guard tended to eschew vehicles, I actually loved demon engines in particular. This was before they were a standalone army and had a slew of their own. Enter Khorne Daemonkin. The Codex already solved an annoyance of mine. The demons and mortals in 40k were separate armies. While I understood the mechanics, the imagery of Nurglings clinging to Plague Marines and carrying palanquins aloft, a Chaos Lord riding a Juggernaut into battle, had always made the distinction seem arbitrary to me. And in that they had always been part of the same army list before, it seemed like the separation was arbitrary. As well, since the Demons book had always been written around an incursion of multiple gods, taking a demons list generally meant either taking multiple gods' demons together or sacrificing a great deal of flexibility in order to run the demons only from the one god. Here was a book built around only Khorne. It's hard to explain how exciting this was now, when Thousand Sons and Death Guard have their own complete armies, when each god has their own battle tome of Age of Sigmar. But at the time Daemonkin came out, there wasn't anything like that. There weren't even faction rules for Chaos. That alone made it special. And this is just the beginning. The demon units in their codex had a rule called demonic instability. It prevented them from being joined by any characters that didn't have the same demonic instability rule. This was back, of course, when characters could join a squad rather than the current way of playing. Daemonkin threw that out and made the demons fearless instead, which suddenly opened up the glorious combo of a Chaos Lord on Juggernaut leading a squad of Blood Crushers on the charge, or leading a unit of Flesh Hounds as a hunting pack, or a Herald of Khorne charging with a line of Khorne Berserkers. This action was ripped straight from the pages of Black Library, but it was crucially encoded into the rules. One of the things commonly associated with the Chaos Gods are sacred numbers. 6 for Slaanesh, 7 for Nurgle, though Nurgle also likes 3s, and 8 for Khorne, 9 for Tzeentch. Fittingly, all the troop units in the game had a minimum size of 8. You could add more, but why risk angering Khorne by messing with his favor? The number 8 repeats elsewhere in the army's formations and in meta detachments of the Blood Host, which we'll talk about more comprehensively in a little bit. One thing players of the time would notice is the typical Eye of the Gods table a Chaos Space Marine champion or leader would roll on after slaying an enemy had disappeared. This table was one of the single best parts of the Chaos Space Marine Codex, ensuring that even a lowly Chaos champion could become brutally powerful, degrade into a spawn, or if you got really lucky, receive apotheosis and ascend to become a demon prince right then and there on the tabletop. Having a Chaos Cultist champion get a lucky win in a challenge, and seeing them burst apart and reassemble into a 20-foot-tall creature of unreality was glorious. Easily some of the most enjoyable experiences I had playing Warhammer 40,000. But what does Khorne Daemonkin do to replace this fantastic mechanic? Well, we get something altogether more awesome. The Blood Tithe table. Khorne Daemonkin players would keep track each turn of every unit killed by a unit with the Blood for the Blood God rule, every character killed in a challenge with a character with the rule, and crucially, any of their own units with that rule that were killed or characters killed. This meant each unit in the army down to the lowly Rhino could generate these resources, and the Rhino, which had become something of an awful choice in most armies at the time, was suddenly very useful, as it not only offered transportation and cover. When it was inevitably destroyed, it would contribute towards your resource of Blood Tithe. It's hard to understate how game-changing earning in-game resources by dying was to a Khorne army. First, Khorne demon units were generally not that durable, functioning as glass hammers to get in and do immediate damage on the charge, not to be able to take a lot of punishment back. It made it tough to play them in a way that matches their background, sprinting into the close combat regardless of the odds, or what hell was raining down on them. Chaos Space Marines were a little tougher, but they didn't punch quite as hard, and so they ran into similar issues. Add in that for most of 40k's history, shooting was significantly more reliable than close combat, and you had a recipe for ludonarrative dissonance that at times meant having to choose between making the best play to win by going for an objective or hiding your demons, and the narrative best play, which would fit the background, relentlessly focusing on slaughtering with little regard for personal safety. By rewarding players for sacrificing their units, the game fulfilled the well-known adage that khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it flows. So, what exactly do these blood tithe points do? Well, you can bank up to 8 and spend them at the beginning of each turn. Spending any would reset the blood tithe count to 0, something I do think was a bit harsh and would have worked better as subtracting the cost, but honestly it was rare that I would spend less than all my points, so this is a minor quibble, particularly when we get into the benefits of the slaughter cult later on. Spending 1 point gave every model with Blood for the Blood God the Adamantine Will special rule, which gave you a bonus for dispelling your opponent's psychic powers. Spoiler alert, this was not a commonly used reward. It just wasn't a big enough buff to lose the blood tithe point. They're worth a lot. At 2 points, you could give every model with the Blood for the Blood God rule the Furious Charge and Rage special rules. Furious Charge gave every unit +1 strength on the charge, and Rage gave a unit 2 bonus attacks when charging instead of 1. While these were already rules that some units had, this could make your Chaos Space Marines hit as hard as khorne Berserkers, which made them a worthwhile purchase suddenly, despite previously being not as effective as their cult brethren. At 3 points, we start getting great benefits, granting everyone with the rule Feel No Pain. This gave them a bonus 5-up save after taking a wound, allowing them to keep fighting through grievous injuries that would have normally killed them, driven as they are by the fury of their god. At 4 points, you add +1 to all units with Blood for the Blood God attack characteristic. This buffs just about everyone in the army to be that much meaner, as the units that already have rage wouldn't benefit from it are suddenly becoming absolute blenders with their blades. But 5 blood tithe is where the table really became a game changer. But to fully understand why, you need to understand 7th edition a little more. While 6th edition of Warhammer 40k had introduced psychic powers shared between armies, 7th had expanded on them more as a concept, and one of the things added was summoning. Via a psychic discipline called Malefic Daemonology, a psyker could use their mental powers to tear a hole in reality and bring forth demons. This was very thematic and fun, but it posed a bit of a problem for khorne players. The Blood God hates magic and sorcery. By definition, any psychic-based buff to Chaos players was going to miss khorne, because khorne won't mark psychers and he will not bless them. So the best you could do was having undivided sorcerers in your Chaos Space Marine list, creating more of that ludonarrative dissonance that we keep talking about. But the Blood Tithe changed all of that. At 5 points, you could summon a unit of lesser demons, either 8 Bloodletters or 5 Fleshhounds, within 12 inches of one of your units with the Blood for the Blood God rule. Meaning if you started to take bad losses or you hit your enemy really hard, you could bring in demons tearing through the veil of reality due to the sacrifices made in khorne's name on both sides, exactly as described in the narrative of your army. At 6 points, you could instead summon a unit of Blood Crushers or a Skull Cannon. This was really fun as a vehicle. Basically, a giant chaotic motorcycle would come screaming out of the warp and launch flaming skulls at your opponent. Just beautiful to witness on the tabletop. Plus, it was really cool to be able to generate a unit that would deep strike in and be able to do something on the turn they come in. At 7 points, we of course have Dark Apotheosis. You could take a leadership check for one of your mortal champions. If they fail, they're judged unworthy and they become a spawn. If they succeed, they are replaced with a Demon Prince, which can include wings if you want, a difference from the Chaos Space Marine Apotheosis table. Ascending from their mortal form to become a creature of the warp. Obviously, seeing your character become a god is awesome, but there is still an even greater option. At 8 Blood Tithe points, the sacred number of khorne, you are allowed to instead sacrifice one of your mortal champions to become a vessel for a Bloodthirster, the greater demon of khorne. The model had to take a leadership test, and if it failed, it would outright die. But if they passed, the demon would replace them on the battlefield. As absolute engines of destruction, summoning a Bloodthirster was always a game changer. whether as a last-ditch tool to do some damage in a losing battle or as a culmination of your brutal slaughter of your enemies. This table was a stroke of genius, simultaneously incentivizing the player to play their army's strengths and offering a replacement for the summoning mechanic that fit perfectly with the army's story. This alone would be enough for me to call this the greatest codex of all time. I am not joking, but it doesn't stop there. The warlord traits also fit the theme of gameplay synergizing with background. They can make your general a more perfect killer, from Icon of War allowing the general and units within 12 inches to reroll charges, Disciple of Khorne, which gave the general the Zealot rule, which then let them reroll hits for the first round of combat, a brutal addition when Khorne leaders are already known for being choppy. Arch Slaughterer would give them +1 attack. Favorite of Khorne is perhaps my favorite, granting a bonus blood tithe anytime your general slays someone in a challenge, meaning when you kill another independent character in combat, you would receive 3 points, 1 for killing a unit, 1 for killing a character in a challenge, and a bonus for your warlord trait. Butcher King gave the preferred enemy rule, which let you reroll to hit and wound rolls of 1, also very useful. And finally, Destined for Glory guaranteed your warlord would pass the leadership test to become a demon prince or summon a bloodthirster. The book also had a stack of fun artifacts that you could select. There was Blessed Armor, useful for giving a character Eternal Warrior, which made them immune to instant death weapons, Feel No Pain. There is the Brazen Rune, which granted Adamantine Will once per game and would cause a 24-inch bubble of Perils of the Warp for any doubles or psychic tests, which was very thematic. There was the Skull Helm of Khorne, which gave a fighter Fear plus bonus attacks on to hit rolls of 6. And of course, there were demonic weapons. There was Gore Drinker, an axe that gained more power the more it killed. The Blade of Endless Bloodshed, which generated additional blood tithe. And perhaps the greatest weapon in all of Warhammer 40,000, Khor Loth, the Axe of Ruin. It is said that every Axe of Khorne contains a trapped bloodthirster. And since every bloodthirster has an Axe of Khorne, it therefore follows that every bloodthirster carries a bloodthirster in their weapon that also has a bloodthirster in their weapon, all the way down forever. Khor Loth was just such an axe. It gave the instant death rule to attack rolls of 6, and when your hero goes to 0 wounds, a bloodthirster is summoned in their place. The summon model loses D3 wounds a turn, though you get invulnerable saves against them, but it's otherwise a full-on bloodthirster. I used to take this on a Chaos Lord on a Juggernaut and launch them headlong into the hairiest melee around, attached to a unit of Fleshhounds. If he lives, he kills. If he dies, a bloodthirster appears deep in enemy engagement range, but we'll get to how I played them a little bit later.
And just to expound upon how narratively excellent this book was, while I'm editing, I am now adding another section here to talk about the tactical objectives. Another thing that I found while I was digging through the book, if you don't remember in 7th edition or didn't play, there were tactical objectives that work similar to the open war deck that is, I believe, still part of the game. But basically, you would roll up objectives in order to determine what you wanted to do to achieve victory. And what was cool about this edition in the book is it actually replaces the first 6 results on the table. There was also a corresponding card pack that included all of these cards so that you could generate your objectives that way. And these are, of course, directly themed around what the army wants to do on the tabletop. You get such excellent examples as number 11, Khorne Cares Not. You get a victory point at the end of your turn if at least one unit was completely destroyed. If 3 to 5 were destroyed, you get D3 victory points. And if 6 or more, D3 plus 3. And that includes your own units. Perfectly themed around exactly what a Khorne army wants to be doing on the tabletop. Murder Call. Score a victory point at the end of your turn if, during your turn, at least one unit with the Demon of Khorne special rule arrived from Deep Strike. Bringing in demons scores you victory points because your goal is to start a demonic incursion. This book, I swear, it's amazing.
With all that wonderful, narratively aligned content already covered, you'd think that that'd be everything, right? But the book has one last trick to take it from a good book, one of the all-time greatest, to the greatest. And that zhuzh comes in the form of the Blood Host Detachment. A word about Decurion detachments. 7th edition was truly the Games Workshop design team at their most self-indulgent. If you wanted a competitive, evenly matched experience, the game was deeply flawed. It was bad even. But that didn't mean the game was bad itself. It just needed to be handled with a bit of restraint. Very silly combinations were possible at times in 7th edition, from 2 rerollable saves rendering some models functionally invincible, to Eldar at one point being able to summon Slaanesh demons to attack their foes. But 7th was also a time of very open and flexible rules, and one of the coolest was formations. Simply put, a formation is a group of models taken together outside of a standard army detachment. You could take these detachments to, say, put a bunch of dreadnoughts into a Chaos Space Marine list beyond the usual limit of 3 that were constrained to their slots. Some armies already had rules that allowed them to move units around from various force organization slots to others, and allowed them to take variant armies, but formations opened up the possibility of building an army around any unit featured in a formation, something that really opened up your list building and narrative options if you were not playing one of those armies that already let you do this. Formations also generally granted bonus rules or mechanics themed around operational purposes of the unit. More synergy abounds here, and these were one of the things that made 7th edition a really compelling narrative game. It literally rewarded you with themed buffs for taking themed units. It was awesome! There was, of course, excess at times, particularly in the case of a notorious detachment that gave Space Marines free transports. Much was made of it at the time, about it being off balance or what have you, but if I recall correctly, it was not a particularly popular choice because even though it granted a bunch of free rhinos, it required you to field almost entirely Marines, which wasn't a particularly flexible list. It was all tacticals and assault Marines and devastators, which were not really popular choices at the time. So there was probably a bit of an exaggeration about how bad formations were at the time. Formations first debuted in 6th edition, but starting with the Necron Codex in February of 2015, were introduced to a new kind of alternate detachment. Rather than just a bunch of formations in the back of the Codex or in a PDF online, the Necron book contains something called a Decurion detachment. This was intended to represent the structure of the Necron tomb worlds, and was made up of different formations and granted benefits to the whole army. This was a really fun concept, and it's the peak of narrative gaming in Warhammer 40,000 in my opinion. 7th edition Warhammer 40,000 wanted you to play the game in a way that fit the background, in a way that rewarded you for playing to the background. And it doesn't feel like the game now does anything close to that. But of all the meta detachments from the books of 7th edition, to me, the coolest by far is the Blood Host detachment. It's not the most broken or spammable. In fact, people complained about it requiring you to take Possessed, a unit that wasn't pulling its weight at the time, but belonged in an army of demon-obsessed lunatics. The Blood Host's main benefit was generating a free blood tithe every turn, but it also allowed you to reroll your roll in the Warlord trait table, of course. This may not seem like a big deal, but it meant 6 free blood tithe throughout the 6-round game. That's nearly a free bloodthirster in and of itself, which is amazing. At the core of the detachment is the Slaughter Cult, led by a Bloodthirster, Herald, Demon Prince, or Chaos Lord, backed up by 2 to 8 units of Berserkers, Chaos Space Marines, or Bloodletters, a minimum of 1 unit of Possessed, up to 2 units of Spawn, and 2 units of Cultists. This is obviously the core of an army, and comes with a rule allowing you to choose to remove a unit as a casualty, rather than have to flee after failing a morale test. And more importantly, Boon of Khorne, which enabled you to take a second lesser benefit from the Blood Tithe table and apply it to the Slaughter Host when you spent Blood Tithe points. Suddenly, spending your points on summoning doesn't just mean losing Rage and Furious Charge on your Chaos Space Marines. No, you can have your cake, and you can eat it too. After taking your Slaughter Cult, you could also take a Lord of Slaughter, which would allow you to take any of the 3 kinds of Bloodthirster. You would need to take between 1 and 8 additional formations, choosing from Brazen Onslaught, Khorne's Bloodstorm, the Gore Pack, the Charnel Cohort, or a Hellbrooder Demon Engine. First of all, before we get into the formations themselves, the option to take up to 8 Demon Engines was spectacular. I had 2 Soul Grinders and 2 Mauler Fiends, plus 2 Helldrakes and any number of Hellbrutes. This was the first time that I could bring a list that was almost entirely Demon Engines. I loved it so much that it led me to expand on my Demon Engines extensively, but we'll get into that later. The rest of the formations were just as themed as the Slaughter Cult. The Brazen Onslaught combined 1 to 4 units of Terminators and 2 to 4 units of Blood Crushers. It gave them all a rule that if they were outnumbered in any combat, add 1 to their attacks. Since both units come in 3s, the odds of them being outnumbered are very good, and combined with the potential for Blood Tithe benefits, boosting their attacks further, the formation helps turn them into killing machines. Khorne's Bloodstorm were 2 to 4 units of Raptors and 1 to 4 units of Warp Talons and up to 1 Helldrake. This formation gave all the units +1 strength for their free Hammer of Wrath hits caused by their jetpacks, and to the Helldrake's Vector Strike. While not as potent as a bonus attack, the fact that the formation let you take as many jump pack models as you wanted meant that all kinds of new lists were possible. Think Night Lords, Turn to Khorne, that sort of thing. Next up is my favorite formation in all of 7th edition, the Gore Pack. With 2 to 4 units of Chaos Bikes and 1 to 4 units of Fleshhounds, the Gore Pack gave both units move through cover, preferred enemy Psyker, and granted the Hounds Hammer of Wrath, and gave the bikes Shred on Hammer of Wrath. Just the fact that you could take bikes with impunity was huge. I'd been building Red Corsairs for years, but it was hard to run a bike list, because so many things were fighting for the fast attack slots in a combined arms detachment, and Chaos Space Marines didn't have a way to move bikes to their troop slot. Suddenly, I could take as many bikes as I wanted, and Huron Blackheart is known to be a lover of pets, so packs of hunting dogs running down his enemies works perfectly as the core of a Red Corsair's army. The final detachment of the book was the Charnel Cohort. It was sort of a small army of demons unto itself. Starting with one of the Demon HQ models, you could then take 2 to 8 units of Bloodletters, 1 to 4 units of Fleshhounds, 1 to 4 units of Blood Crushers, and 0 to 4 units of Skull Cannons. Everything in the formation gained the counterattack special rule, and the formation HQ could re-roll reserve rolls, and other units from the formation would not scatter within 6 inches of the leader.
Additionally, enemy models got -2 to fear checks.
So that gives you an idea of what the detachment and the various formations offered a Khorne Daemonkin player. It was wall-to-wall theme. Every single bit of this codex was trying to convey to you the exact experience of what playing a Khorne Demon army is supposed to be. It is unmatched in anything I've played since. Truly, it was glorious. Khorne Daemonkin changed the way I think about gaming. It inspired me to embark on a number of projects. I'd been building Red Corsairs for a few years, but I converted a ton of extra bikes to make enough to run a bunch of the Gore Pack, as well as making Fleshhounds to represent the hunting packs of Huron Blackheart, known to keep pets. I built a Slaughter Cult, and I added cool Chaos Spawn proxies to match the dynamic look of the army. I began to collect more Demon Engines to be able to run an almost all Demon Engine list. I bought Blood Crushers and converted the Fantasy Juggernaut Riders to 2 Lords and a Herald. I built a Bloodthirster, and I converted an old metal one to fly at the right height. I even bought a Chitin Demon Engine to bring in. The only thing I never added, but I wanted, was the Forge World Khorne Demon Engine, the Blood Slaughterers. Unfortunately, they were a bit expensive, and by the time I was ready to buy them, Khorne Daemonkin had breathed its last breath. My favorite part of playing the army was the absolute certainty of purpose. I deployed aggressively. I used rhinos for mobile cover to move Chaos Space Marines. Everyone avoided running Chaos Space Marines at the time, let alone Chaos Space Marines and rhinos. But they would become second wave chargers once their rhinos were shot apart, benefiting from the Slaughter Cult's bonus to take a second result on the Blood Tithe chart as points started to rack up. Possessed were a required unit, and they became another rhino-bound unit thrown into enemy territory. Demons would be summoned throughout the game as I killed and took casualties in return. My lords would run with a pack of Fleshhounds or in a unit of bikes, and I could take Spawn, another underused unit at the time, in nearly every list. I mentioned earlier my list with 2 Helldrakes, 2 Soul Grinders, 2 Mauler Fiends. It also had 2 Bloodthirsters. This would expand into a whole Dark Mechanicus project eventually, but that project is a video into itself. I came up with a story for my Khorne Lord, who had been turned down from demonhood 3 times, which led him to find the Axe of Ruin, and while he has many times fallen, his sacrifice summoning the beast within the axe, Khorne has always seen fit to bring him back, continuing to toy with his minion, knowing that he suffers so. This was what Khorne Daemonkin was all about. The glory of telling a story, of embracing ruin, of embracing death and chaos. I have a hard time explaining it in a way that doesn't rely on the need for you to have experienced something like it. I don't know if everyone has experienced this kind of feeling playing a tabletop game. I say that because I didn't know I was missing it until that time. I mean, that's not really true. I knew something was missing. I knew something was wrong with the way I was playing games. Something was off, and it was not something I could put my finger on. But in time, I would learn. So, conclusions. In the end, the choice of what codex, or army book, or battle tome is the greatest of all time is a deeply personal question. It's tied up in why you like a game, what you want to get out of it, what drives you. Playing Khorne Daemonkin scratched an itch better than anything I'd ever experienced in 40k. Losing it with the launch of 8th edition was a great enough loss to spoil the new edition completely for me. It led me to pretty much quit company Skell Gaming. I searched for that same amazing feeling I felt playing Khorne Daemonkin. I looked hard. I played Age of Sigmar. I played board games. It wasn't until I came across the current edition of Necromunda, coming a few months after the 8th edition release, that I really found something that gave me the exact feeling of what I wanted out of Khorne Daemonkin. That feeling where what you're doing on the tabletop is part of a story. It conveys meaning in a way that just rolling dice never could. That's why I love the game so much. It's why I'm such a vocal advocate for Necromunda, because it's unlike anything else Games Workshop makes now. It's better in a way that's hard to sum up. But that, of course, is a video unto itself as well. So, while I have moved on from Warhammer 40k and reduced the size of my Chaos collection considerably, I haven't stopped working on my Red Corsairs. I have an updated take on the army sitting on my painting desk right in front of me. I've been working on them all month. Further, in some ways the inheritor of Khorne Daemonkin's mechanics has been Chaos armies in Age of Sigmar. Each receive theme buffs like the Blood Tithe that they earn various ways in accordance with their god's theme, but sadly Warhammer 40k has gone in a very different direction. Some of us out there still hope that one day Games Workshop will see fit to resurrect the short-lived but stunningly brilliant Khorne Daemonkin, bringing back the army list that, to me, changed the scale on which I rate all other army lists. The book that broke the mold, if you will. Nothing else, perhaps, will ever fill me with the same joy, but at least we still have it. And technically speaking, 7th edition, strange as it is, still lives to this day. So tomorrow, if someone were so inclined, they could pull out a copy of the Age of Darkness, and they could sit down and put together a Khorne Daemonkin list, and they could rock up with their demons and their Chaos Space Marines and punch some 30k face just to see how it goes. But I suspect they won't, because Warhammer 40,000 Horus Heresy is a bit of a narrative game in and of itself, and I'm sure we'll talk about that eventually as well. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope that this was informative.
And if you have a moment, I would love it if you'd take a second and leave a comment and tell me what your favorite codex of all time is. Because I think that this experience is different for everyone, and it illuminates a lot about what we are looking to get out of a game. And of course, as always, if you like what you see and hear in this show, I recommend checking out the podcast at domerunners.buzzsprout.com. And of course, the show has a Patreon that helps keep the lights on around here, so to speak. If you like the show, if you want to see more long-form rambling about game design concepts and the like, I would love for you to drop into Patreon, and you can come chat with me in Discord and whatnot. I appreciate everyone who watches these videos. I really enjoy talking about these topics, and that's really what I'm doing here. So please, know that if you're listening this far into the video, that I really appreciate that you're still here. So thank you, and good night.